Stories need room. Readers make room for them in their car, on the treadmill, while walking the dog, or in those quiet moments before sleep. Writers make room for them in already crowded lives. And nonfiction writers make room for the research, sources, and careful truth telling that let readers trust the journey. Today we were talking about all three. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Stitches and Stories Studio, the podcast where stories begin. I'm your host, Millie Story, writing as Melissa L. Story in science fiction and crime noir, and as Lynn Story in contemporary romance. So, wherever you're listening today, driving home from work, folding the laundry, walking the dog, knitting something lovely, maybe watering the garden, or sitting quietly with a cup of tea that you've reheated twice already, I'm very glad you're here. Today's episode has three conversations in it, and at first glance, they may look like three different topics. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about Spotify's reported growth in audiobook listening and a feature called PageMatch that may be changing the way readers move between printed books and audio. We're going to talk about the harder, more personal question of what a writer is willing to give up in order to write. And then we're going to settle into the beginning of a conversation about writing nonfiction, especially history-based nonfiction, the research tools, the narrative style, sources, and how to begin without becoming overwhelmed by a mountain of index cards, newspaper clippings, and one very suspicious browser tab collection. The thread running through all three of these conversations is simple. Stories need room. Readers make room for the stories in their daily lives. Writers make room for the stories in their time, their routines, and their attention, in between everything else that's happening in their lives. Nonfiction writers have to make room for the truth of the subject by researching carefully and documenting where that truth came from. So pour yourself up something warm or cold, maybe even caffeinated. Maybe caffeinated enough to count as its own personality trait. Let's talk about making room for story. I want to begin this week with a piece of publishing news that caught my attention because it hits right at the intersection of reader behavior, technology, and the opportunity for independent authors. Dan Holloway reported on the Alliance of Independent Authors blog, better known as Ally, that Spotify announced a significant increase in audiobook engagement during its recent Investor Day reporting. According to Spotify, audiobook listening hours increased by 60% year over year in 2025. Now, I want to pause there and be precise about what that means. Spotify is reporting an increase in listening hours. They're talking about people spending more time listening to audiobooks on that platform. That does not automatically mean every audiobook author saw a 60% increase in sales, and it does not mean every title benefited equally. Still, as a measure of audience behavior, it's worth paying attention to. People are spending more time with audiobooks. And according to Spotify's May 2026 Investor Day recap, nearly half of Spotify's audiobook consumers began listening through the platform within the previous 12 months. That suggests Spotify is not only serving people who are already regular audiobook listeners, it may also be introducing audio reading to people who may not have made audiobooks a regular part of their reading lives before. And for authors, especially independent authors, that's a very interesting development. Now, before I go further, I want to say that Dan Holloway reported this through the Ally blog. And if you're an independent author who is serious about your publishing business, I highly encourage you to go over there and take a look and even join the Alliance of Independent Authors. Ally consistently provides practical information about self-publishing, rights, distribution, marketing, industry developments, author advocacy, and questions that come up when you're trying to run a creative business in a publishing world that changes approximately every 15 minutes. There are plenty of voices online telling authors what they should be doing. Ally has earned a reputation for offering useful guidance grounded in actual basic business of being an independent author. And when you're trying to decide where to spend your time, your money, and your trust, that's something that really matters. Now, back to Spotify. One of the features Spotify credits with helping deepening the audiobook engagement is something called PageMatch. PageMatch was introduced earlier this year, and I find the idea fascinating because it's designed around how people actually read. With PageMatch, a reader who owns a physical copy of a book can scan the page they are currently reading, and then Spotify will take them to the corresponding place in the audiobook. Later, when that reader returns back to their printed book, the feature helps them find the proper page again. So imagine this. You're reading your novel in bed at night. You reach the end of a chapter and finally, and even reluctantly, put the book down because morning comes whether or not the fictional spaceship has just escaped the hostile moon. The next day, you get in your car, and instead of starting something different, you continue with the same book but in audio. Later, you're home again, curled up in your chair, and you move back to the paperback. The story can move with you. And what interests me about PageMatch is that it treats reading and listening as connected experiences. The printed book is not sitting to one side on the audiobook and pretending that they're competing with for each other's for the reader's loyalty. They are both doors into the same story. So, Spotify reports that readers using PageMatch showed an uplift in audiobook listening of up to 55% over a month, and that these readers finished the books twice as fast. Again, those are Spotify's figures, and the early figures are connected to Spotify's own platform. Even with the necessary caution, the implication is worth considering. Readers who can move easily between platforms may stay with the book longer, return to it more consistently, and reach the ending sooner. And as for readers, that makes a lot of sense. Our lives don't always come with a generous, undisturbed afternoon set aside for reading. Sometimes reading happens in fragments 20 minutes before bed, 15 minutes in the waiting room, a chapter on the treadmill, an audiobook playing while we're cooking dinner, or weeds are being pulled, or the floor finally gets vacuumed because company's coming and judgment is real. A book can move through these different pieces of the reader's day, and then it has more opportunities to remain present. Authors need these readers to remain present. We need the reader to finish the book so that they can recommend it to a friend. A reader who finishes a book can also move to book two, which is important for those series writers. A reader who becomes invested in the world and the character or a series is far more valuable than a reader who bought a book once and even forgot where they put it. For those of us writing the series fiction, particularly science fiction, fantasy, romance, mystery, thrillers, and other genres where readers enjoy staying in the world across multiple books, this matters enormously. Spotify has been building out Spotify for authors, and this is where the conversation becomes especially practical for indie writers. Spotify for authors allows self-published authors to publish audiobooks directly to Spotify. Authors can create an account, upload audiobook titles, set up a payment profile, build an author presence, use promotional tools, and see certain audience insights. Those insights could include aggregated information such as demographic, geographic, and interest data, including affinity information showing what podcasts and other authors listeners also enjoy. That kind of information can be valuable. Suppose an author writes historical mysteries and discovers that their audiobook audience also regularly listens to true crime podcasts or history programs. That may suggest possible themes for the newsletter content, podcast appearances, social media conversations, and cross promotional opportunities. Suppose a science fiction author discovers listeners are also engaging with space exploration podcasts, or particularly subgenres of speculative fiction. That may shape how future books are positioned and marketed. Data never replaces creative judgment, though. It does not tell you what book your heart needs to write. What it can do is help you understand where the readers who already respond to your work may be gathering. And that's valuable information, too, for any independent author who's trying to market thoughtfully instead of throwing promotional confetti in every direction, hoping one piece lands on a reader. Spotify for authors also offers promotional tools such as author profiles and redemption codes. Redemption codes allows the author or the publisher to share an audiobook copy for promotional purposes. For indie writers, that can become part of a launch strategy. Maybe an audiobook review team, early copies for newsletter readers, and a giveaway tied to a series release. A cross promotion with another author whose readers may enjoy your work can also be benefit from this option as well. So Spotify also says that self-published authors can choose broader distribution through Voices by In Audio after uploading through Spotify for authors. And that's an important detail because indie publishing is often about flexibility. And authors want to be able to reach readers without locking every format into one narrow path unless there's a clear business plan to do so. There's another piece that's worth mentioning. Spotify has partnered with bookshop.org to offer pathways for purchasing physical books through the Spotify experience in the United States and the UK. Now think about that for a minute. We've talked about D2D and bookshop.org merging or having a relationship, but now a listener discovers an audiobook on Spotify, begins enjoying it, and then has a path toward buying the printed version through bookshop.org, supporting independent bookstores. For readers who love owning physical copies of a book, that matters to them, and that connection is natural. For authors, it enforces the idea of format supporting one another. Audio does not have to take the reader away from print, and print doesn't have to prevent a reader from listening. A book may begin in someone's headphones and eventually end up on the shelf. Or it may begin as a paperback resting on a nightstand and become an audiobook accompanying them through a long drive. And that's not a threat to the story. That's the story finding another way into someone's life. So, what does all this mean for authors who are listening today? First, it means audiobook growth deserves attention. Every author has different resources, different audiobook productions that can involve significant decisions about budget, narration, quality, distribution, and timing. No one should hear a publishing statistic and immediately feel that they're already behind. That panic has launched many expensive choices into the publishing world. Still, authors planning long-term catalogs, especially writing in series, may also want to think about audio as part of their future publishing strategy. Second, it means discoverability is increasing and connected to reader convenience. Readers are busy, but they're still hungry for stories. Tools that help a story fit naturally into a reader's day may give that story more of a chance to be completed and loved. Third, authors may want to spend some time exploring the Spotify for Authors option, reading about its tools, and understanding how their own current or future audiobook catalog can fit into the platform. And you don't have to make every decision today. You do need to notice when readers are forming new habits around books, though, because the way readers read, as always, has shaped the opportunities for writers. And that brings me to a quieter thought. Spotify's PageMatch feature is ultimately about helping readers move through a book despite a busy life. The reader has a commute, chores, responsibilities, distractions like children's pets, work, appointments, a garden that grows weeds with the ambition of an empire, and somehow the story still finds a place in their day. Writers face a similar question, but from the other side of the page. We want to write. We love the idea of writing. We talk about writing for hours. We can research pens, notebooks, writing programs, productivity methods, character templates, beautiful desks, inspirational candles, and the exact tea consumed by authors in cottages overlooking foggy moors. Eventually, the story looks at us and asks one deeply inconvenient question. When are you going to sit down and write me? So that's a perfect segue into when are you going to write? Writers talk often about finding time to write. We say we need more hours in the day. We say our schedules are too busy. We're too tired. We've got work, family, chores, appointments, responsibilities. And then there's the marketing, the newsletters, and the life in general that keeps taking bites out of our time. And all of that's true. And many writers carry very full lives. A person working a demanding job and raising children, caring for a family member, managing health issues, trying to maintain relationships, keeping enough clean laundry available to remain socially acceptable is not imagining the pressure on their time. Finding time to write is hard. Still, there comes a point when the question changes. Instead of asking, where will I find the time to write? You may need to ask, what am I willing to give up in order to write? That sounds severe when you hear it for the first time. It sounds as though someone is preparing to confiscate your favorite television series, your weekend plans, and every cookie in the cabinet until you've reached your word count. But that's not what I mean. Writing should not require a person to burn down the rest of their lives. A sustainable, creative life needs sleep, relationships, ordinary joy, walks, meals, laughter, gardens, pets, hobbies, rest, and days when nothing productive happens except surviving the grocery store and putting gas in the car. The goal is not to become a hollow-eyed writing machine clutching a mug of coffee and whispering about deadlines. The goal is to recognize that a meaningful creative life requires choices. Something will receive less attention so that writing can receive more. Sometimes the first thing we need to give up is distractions. This one is the obvious one and perhaps the most irritating because distractions does not always feel like a major choice. It feels like checking your phone for a minute. It feels like opening social media while you're waiting for the kettle to boil. It feels like watching one more video, that one more, than one involving the rescue dog, or now you're emotionally invested and cannot possibly leave until you learn whether the dog gets adopted. Of course, the dog gets adopted, and then you've lost 45 minutes. The internet is beautifully designed to catch your attention and carry it away in tiny pieces. But those tiny pieces add up, and a writer may genuinely have very little spare time and still discover that some of it is quietly being spent in ways that leave them less rested, less fulfilled, and no closer to the work they really care about. And this is not about scolding ourselves. Shame is a terrible writing coach. It's about noticing, looking at how you're spending your time carefully. Where does your time go? When is it that you feel too tired to write? Which activities truly restore you? And which ones feel you leaving as though an hour just simply vanished? This is the difference between rest and escape. Rest gives something back. A walk gives something back. Knitting can give something back. Reading does as well. A conversation with someone you love is giving something back. Staring at your phone while your brain becomes increasingly convinced that someone else is more successful, more organized, and somehow living in houses without clutter doesn't usually give much back. Sometimes the first writing sacrifice is simply choosing 10 fewer minutes of noise and 10 more minutes with the story. 10 minutes may not sound impressive, but 10 minutes repeated consistently can build pages, and pages can become chapters, chapters become manuscripts. And you remember back in, I think, episode 1 or 2, we were talking about finding time, 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day for 5 days to build a writing habit. And this can help us get there if you haven't established that already. So that's how books are written, far more often than some dramatic burst of inspiration accompanied by thunder, candlelight, and perfectly behaving cats. Another thing writers sometimes have to give up is the fantasy of perfect conditions. We tell ourselves we will write when the office is clean, the research is complete, our outline is flawless. We have a new notebook. The weather changes, the house is quiet, our work schedule eases. Maybe we're waiting for the holidays to be over. It's a New Year's resolution in January to write more. But January can quickly become February. Perfect conditions are wonderful, but they are also suspiciously rare. Most books are written in ordinary rooms during ordinary weeks by people who have other things happening in their lives. A scene may be drafted before work, chapter revised in the evening when the writer had much rather be watching something on TV. A notebook may sit by the chair while the idea is scribbled down during a commercial break. A voice memo may catch a line of dialogue while the writer is walking the dog. Writing life is built on the margins of life before it ever becomes the center. To write consistently, we may have to give up the belief that real writing sessions must be long, beautifully organized, and worthy of appearing in a photograph with a steaming teacup and artfully placed fountain pen. Sometimes real writing happens with the laptop badly balanced on our knees while the dog sighs. You've clearly forgotten that moment in your life that belongs to that dog. But that work still counts. It's still real. Then there's the sacrifice that may be the hardest for creative people, giving up on other good ideas. Writers tend to have more ideas than time. A new idea is delicious. It arrives sparkling with possibilities. Characters seem fascinating. The setting is fresh. The plot has no middle yet, which means it has not begun making real, reasonable demands. Meanwhile, the current book is sitting in chapter 19, tangled in subplots, emotional complications, and a scene that refuses to cooperate. Of course, the new story looks appealing because it hasn't caused any trouble yet. The new story is standing at the door wearing sequins and holding a bouquet, while the current manuscript is in the kitchen asking why you forgot to buy the milk. Publishing a book often requires giving up pleasures of chasing every new idea immediately. You can write the new idea down, save it in a folder on your laptop, even a physical folder. It can have a short page of notes, and it can be lovely. But then it may need to sit quietly and wait its turn until the story that's already in progress receives the attention it deserves. And that's difficult, especially when the current story becomes hard. Yet a writing career is built on completed work. Readers cannot fall in love with a brilliant project we continually abandon for the next brilliant project. At some point, the writer chooses one story and says, "You're the one I'm bringing home." There's one more sacrifice I want to talk about because to me it matters deeply. Writers sometimes believe that they have to give up on their health, their rest, their peace in order to prove that they are serious. They push until they're exhausted. They feel guilty when they take a break, and they begin measuring commitment by suffering. And that's a poor bargain. The work matters, but so do you. And I say this because I'm guilty of this far more than I'd like to admit. But your story needs a writer who can return tomorrow. Writing can ask for discipline. It asks for focus and asks you to close the browser window and decline unnecessary obligations. Stop publishing the first 3 pages forever, or choose the manuscript over one more of evening that it drifts away. It should not require you to disappear from your own life. A writing career is not one heroic sprint towards collapse. It's a long relationship with your imagination, and you should treat it accordingly. So here is a small question I want to leave you with this week. What is the one thing you're willing to release, reduce, postpone, or simplify so that you make room, a little bit more room anyway, for writing? Is it television, on distraction, an hour online, maybe watching that guy who eats from the Korean convenience store, the unnecessary obligation, maybe a competing project, or the expectation that writing must be perfect before it's allowed to exist? Do not build a complicated system with color-coded blocks and schedules strict enough to require its own administrative assistant. Just choose one of these things. Give the story one small piece of protected space, and then return to it tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Because once you've made room to write, another question appears. What kind of story are you writing? And what responsibility comes with telling it? For fiction writers, imagination opens extraordinary doors. For nonfiction writers, especially those writing history, research-based essays, memoir grounded in fact, local stories, or true crime and biography, perhaps even instructional books, the creative process carries another layer. You're not simply building a compelling narrative, You're building a relationship of trust with your reader. Now, when people hear the phrase writing nonfiction, they sometimes imagine a person in a library surrounded by tall stacks of dusty books, wearing serious glasses and taking notes in tiny handwriting, and knowing instinctively how footnotes work. There may be a cardigan involved. Who knows? Possibly an old clock ticking somewhere in the background. I am personally very fond of that image, and I would happily take the library, the cardigan, and the books. The tiny handwriting is where the fantasy falls apart. The truth is that nonfiction writing can begin in a much simpler place. It begins with curiosity, a question that nags at you, or maybe a person or place that pulls your attention over and over again. A historical event seems incomplete in a way that it is commonly remembered. A life experience that teaches you something you wish someone else had explained to you earlier. A professional subject keeps showing up in your work until you realize you may have something useful to say about it. Nonfiction begins with curiosity, which becomes persistent enough that you're willing to follow it. For writers interested in history, the possibilities are almost endless. You might become fascinated by a historic building in your community or want to explore a local event that has shaped a neighborhood. A family has a story handed down through generations, and you begin wondering about the pieces that can be documented. You may have been researching a historic setting for a novel and discover the real story is so compelling it deserves its own treatment. Maybe you find yourself reading about prohibition, old hotels, forgotten crimes, women who managed businesses in eras when society underestimated them, port cities, vanished communities, the way a place changes over time. Sometimes research undertaken for fiction opens up a second door. And behind that door is a true story quietly waiting for someone to notice it. The biggest mistake a beginning nonfiction writer can make is trying to begin with a subject so broad that it has no edges. I want to write about history is a passion, but it's not yet a project. I want to write about a particular hotel during I want to write about a particular hotel during Prohibition, and that the people who passed through it is a closer project. I want to investigate whether this hotel had documented connections to bootlegging during Prohibition, or how those stories shaped its local reputation is a research question. Questions that give nonfiction direction. Without a question, research just becomes collecting. Collecting's wonderful right up until you have 12 folders, 3 notebooks, 200 browser bookmarks, and no idea what the book is going to say. So, the first step in the beginning of nonfiction writing is to write down your question. What do you want to know? What may you believe to be true? What evidence would help confirm it? What might challenge the version of the story that you started with? And the last question is important. Nonfiction writers need curiosity strong enough to discover something and that have, gosh, I cannot talk. Nonfiction writers need curiosity strong enough to discover something and the humility strong enough to discover that their first assumption may have been incomplete. Whew, glad I got that one out. The goal is not to prove the story we hope to be true. The goal is to find the story where the evidence pointed us and to tell it in a way that readers can understand and remember. Once you have focused on the question, you can then begin to think about the orientation of the research. Sources help you understand the landscape before you get too deep down the rabbit hole for individual facts. This might include general histories, reference books, published biographies, museum exhibits, local history, society materials, state or regional history books, library guides, any credible source that identifies names, dates, locations, and events worth exploring, and they should be primary sources. The sources help you to learn the vocabulary of the subject. They point you toward people you should research or places. It may tell you what records exist, and it may reveal where historians agree and disagree, or the story appears to have gaps. A reference book is always a wonderful first step, and it should never be your only step. A reference source may mention a historical figure, a crime, an incident, or a significant date, and treat that as the trailhead. Ask where the information came from. Follow it towards its original source where possible. Maybe you could find people to interview who maybe have researched the topic before. One, that will give you additional resources, but two, it can help add some rich tapestry to your story to talk about what others have found on the same subject. Primary sources are materials created during the time when you're of the time that you're researching, or by the people directly connected to those events or the person that you may be researching. For a history project, those sources could include newspapers, letters, diaries, photographs, city directories, property records, court documents, business advertisements, meeting minutes, maps or census records, of course, military records, oral histories passed down through generations, any official reports, church records, manifest, menus, postcards, architectural drawings, or any recorded interviews. Primary sources can be helpful when providing facts. They can also provide texture. A newspaper advertisement may show how a business presented itself to the public, and a photograph could reveal clothing or storefronts, street conditions, the physical shape of a community. Meeting minutes can expose formal language used around a decision, while a letter or oral history reveals how people actually felt about it. And of course, property records help establish ownership. Court documents can help establish conflict or perhaps resolve it. A menu may tell you what someone could have ordered in a hotel dining room on an ordinary Thursday evening 80 years ago. The last detail may seem small, but small details are often where the readers feel the history can become human. And while this is important, a vivid detail is only as useful in nonfiction when you know where it came from. Which brings us to the least glamorous and most merciful habit of nonfiction writing, keeping track of your sources from the beginning. Please do not trust yourself to remember it later. You will not remember. What you will remember is that you found an extraordinary fact in a blue book. Was it a blue notebook or a book with a blue cover, an archive with blue buttons? At that point, the fact may become essential to Chapter 4, and you may be spending 3 days researching your own research, like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of your earlier enthusiasm. I say this with affection because every researcher learns this lesson at least once, and even fiction writers do as well. It is far kinder to learn it while you're listening to a podcast than while you're staring at a manuscript with a missing citation. You do not need an elaborate system on the first day, but you do need a consistent system. And we've talked about this before. At minimum, you must take useful notes, record them, the author or organization responsible for the source, the title, the date, the publisher, archive, newspaper, library collection, or website where you found it, the page number, image number, record number, location with its source, and the fact of the quote that you may want to use. And a side note here, you may want to follow the writing style manual for the subject matter that you are researching. So depending on what you plan to do with the work that you're researching, are you planning on publishing something academic, something that you hope could be used in a classroom? So if you're doing history, you may want to follow Turabian. You may want to follow APA. If it's going to be more creative in nature, maybe Chicago style. So you just need to find your place, how you're publishing it, you want to market it to your audience, and make sure you have the style manual for your citations so that they are correctly noted in your book in the correct format, whether it's a footnote or in notes in the back of the book. You just want to make sure that they're done correctly, because that's going to build reader trust. If they know that you've done legitimate research and you have documented it in a way that they can follow and maybe do their own research and use your book as a resource, that's going to be extremely, extremely helpful. So, 6 months into a project, all of this data collection and organization is going to make a huge difference for you. For writers beginning with a small article or newsletter, a personal essay, or a short piece on local history, a simple word or a table or spreadsheet may be enough. You might have columns for dates, pages, topics, useful data, and how you expect to use it. For larger projects, especially with books with dozens or hundreds of sources, I strongly recommend looking into research management tools such as Zotero. Zotero is free and it helps writers collect, organize, cite, build bibliographies from their research sources. You can also create folders for your overall project and then subfolders for topics, people, locations, chapters, timelines, news articles, pictures. And this is kind of a method I follow when I'm doing research on historical fiction for my Matt Collins series. Because it takes place in 1976, there's more physical than digital resources, or digital now that they've been scanned, but they didn't originate in digital format. So I've had some very helpful librarians in the DC and Prince George's County area kindly scan things for me or send me digital copies of photos and things like that for neighborhoods that I'm researching to include in my story. So even though it's fiction, I want to make sure it is taking place in an actual city. So I want to make sure that I have the time frame of that city as it existed in 1976. And it doesn't look the same now. So I interview people who lived there during the time. I have pictures that librarians have sent me, and news articles, things I found on Pinterest, where people have posted old postcards or pictures of something. So, you can find things like menus from restaurants that used to be there that you can find on an Etsy where maybe somebody's selling it, or eBay, or it's just someone posted a picture of it on a nostalgic website. So you can find things in the weirdest places. So just make sure you document where you got it and the resource, and make sure if someone helped you, like a librarian, that you thank them. You give them credit in the book. Um, in my case, I sent them a copy of the book. So just make sure that they know they're appreciated, because you may want their help again in the future. And if they remember that you were appreciative and kind when asking for assistance, they will be more likely to help you again in the future. So we talked about style a little bit before, and this is where fiction writers sometimes underestimate themselves. A writer who knows how to create atmosphere, develop tension or a scene, and guide a reader through emotion already has powerful tools that they can then turn into nonfiction stories as well. So, nonfiction still needs a story. It can't just be a list of facts and dates. A reader wants to know what happened, and they want to understand why it matters. Why should they invest their time in reading this book? They want to see people in a time period, let's say you're writing history, make choices, or in a place, and why they made the choices that they did. And they want to feel it. They want to recognize the conflict and understand the turning point, reaching a fuller understanding of what these people or this place had experienced. And a historical nonfiction piece may open in a room with a letter or a storm, a newspaper report, a courthouse hallway, a woman turning the key in the door to a business she's determined to keep after her husband dies. So those narratives need to have openings that catch the reader's attention, just like you do in fiction. You need to invite the reader into the history and into that human moment. And the discipline comes in knowing where the evidence ends. In fiction, if a character needs a pause at a window and notice the rain sliding down the glass, a novelist can create that moment. But in nonfiction, you may describe rain if there is, in fact, a weather record for that date to say that it was raining. And it could come from a diary entry or a newspaper report, even a photograph. as long as it's a reliable source. You may describe a room using photographs or architectural records, perhaps inventories, published accounts, and documented observations. You may describe a person's actions in words when the records can support it. You should be careful about assigning internal thoughts or private and dramatic feelings and gestures if the evidence does not establish that they responded in that way or would have likely responded in that way. Beautiful nonfiction does not require invented certainty. Sometimes honest sentence is the most powerful one. We do not know what she thought as she stood there, but we do know what she did next, and that creates the trust. And the trust is the foundation of all nonfiction. The nonfiction writer absolutely can use the skills of a novelist, the structure, the pacing, characterization grounded in facts, the settings, sensory details also supported by evidence, and suspense created through the order in which the information is revealed, an emotional arc shaped by real events. What the nonfiction writer cannot do is sacrifice accuracy for a prettier scene. A compelling sentence is wonderful. A supported compelling sentence, even better. Chef's kiss. Once the manuscript begins to develop, sources needed to be presented clearly to the reader. For writers working in history, biography, local history, and many humanities-based subjects, Chicago-style notes and bibliographies is a practical system to explore. In that system, a writer can use footnotes or endnotes to identify sources while also providing bibliography listings of books, records, articles, and archives, and other materials that may have been used. But you don't need to memorize the entire style guide before writing your first page. Please don't let citation anxiety become another creative delay disguised as preparation. What you need to do is have enough information in your source records to create accurate citations later. Write down the full detail, the author, the publication date, page numbers. Save the archive collection name in case you need to go back and find it again. Record the date you accessed the website, and that could matter. Capture a stable link or record the identifier. If you're working with photographs, record the photograph and how it's labeled. Maybe take a picture of it or scan it. Save it if it's already digital. Also remember, if using photos that you did not take, if they're historical photos, you must have permission to reprint those in your book. If you interview someone, document the date, the person's name, the setting, whether the interview was recorded, and whether permission has been given for its use. Gather complete source information, and while the source is directly in front of you, you want to make sure that you're future-proofing yourself, and you will appreciate that later. I also want to say a word about internet research. The internet is a remarkable starting point. Libraries, archives, museums, universities, local governments, all these collections have been placed online in extraordinary databases that give you access to things that you may never be able to physically reach because it's in another state, another city, another country. A writer can begin exploring the subject from the kitchen table in ways that researchers in previous generations could never possibly dream of. But at the same time, that first answer that appears in the search results is not automatically the most reliable answer. So make sure you're vetting your online resources, not just documenting them. Especially for history, please look for the source behind the claim. Who published this information? What evidence does it cite? Is there a transcription of the original record or a scanned document available? There are multiple credible sources out there saying the same thing. You just have to find them. Does the information come from an institution responsible for preserving the record, from a page that was copied from a story somewhere else without explaining where it began? Curiosity opens the door, but verification lets you walk through with confidence. Again, sticking with the local history theme, do not underestimate the value of going beyond the online research. visit the library, talk with the local historian, look at maps, explore newspaper archives, ask whether the manuscript collections, planning documents, deeds, photographs of business directories all have special collections and could be located in the library, in the land records office, often and located in a circuit court. Perhaps some department in city hall, maybe someone who does plan review for buildings. They may have, depending on how far you're going back, some historical documentation there. A lot of that is going to depend on what state you live in and the requirements for record retention in your state. So it's worth a phone call before you go down there to see if documents are available. If you are able to visit the location that you're writing about, walk the location when it's safe or appropriate to do so. Try to soak up the atmosphere without necessarily documenting it at first, but walk through it. Just how does it make you feel? What do you notice? And you can make notes and come back and walk the second time and make the documentation. But try to experience what you think may have happened there before. A lot of people who walk through the battlefield at Gettysburg say they have felt, the presence of the soldiers who fought and died there. So, do you get any sort of feeling when you're walking in a place that you're researching and want to write about? So, let's say that you're listening today and thinking, I've always wanted to write nonfiction, but I don't know where to begin. And here's where I would begin. Choose the aforementioned question. Keep it small enough to investigate. Choose one person, place, or event, one family story, or one local mystery. Then find 5 solid sources, not 50, just 5. Read them carefully. Keep notes that include every useful fact that you glean from that. Write a short piece first. It can be a newsletter article, a blog piece, maybe an essay, a podcast topic. Perhaps it reveals a deeper book waiting underneath. A nonfiction book does not always announce itself in the beginning as a book. Sometimes it begins as a question you simply cannot stop asking. And if you're primarily a fiction writer and nonfiction research can enrich your fiction life as well, research teaches us how real places accumulate secrets. It teaches us how people actually speak in official records and personal letters. It can also teach you that history is filled with surprising motives, strange coincidences, extraordinary courage, petty rivalries, poor decisions, inconvenient weather, and human beings behaving much as human beings have always behaved, which is to say, generously in one moment, irrationally in the next, and usually while wearing clothing they believe was perfectly sensible at the time. Research gives fiction roots. Nonfiction gives research a narrative shape. Both begin with curiosity, and both ask the writer to pay attention. So I was putting together this episode, I kept returning to the phrase, making room for the story. Spotify's PageMatch feature is built around the idea that readers want stories to remain with them while life changes around them. Print at night, audio in the car, another chapter while folding laundry or walking through an afternoon. Writers have to make room from the other direction. Protect your time. Release a distraction. We set aside the tempting new idea long enough to finish the one we're already asking of ourselves. We learn to work in ordinary moments instead of waiting for perfect conditions. When we write nonfiction, we make room for the evidence, for the research. We keep an open mind. Look at the uncertainty of things. A story rarely asks for everything all at once. Most days, it asks for a small act, maybe a page, a new source, an hour. So, wherever you are in your writing life today, I hope you give your story a little room this week. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. A paragraph counts. A few research questions, a source log, a quiet hour with your manuscript counts. The work grows because you keep returning to it. So, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to Stitches and Stories Studio wherever you're listening. Sharing the episode with another writer or reader, and leaving a review would be most appreciated. The small gestures make an enormous difference for an independent podcast like this one. Also, you can find my books, newsletter, podcast updates, and creative projects through stitchesandstories.com and on Substack. And you can find me as Melissa L. Story there. For my science fiction readers, don't forget, Lost Signal is out, continuing to develop Book 2 in Echoes of Eden series. Also, Hostile Skies is available on Amazon. Wonderful anthology, 14 stories, short stories. So you don't want to miss that if you're a sci-fi fan. Stitches and Story Studio offers sponsorship opportunities for writing-related businesses, author services. Also, if you have a book coming out, book release, publishing tools, creative projects, and other offerings that would align with the audience as writers and readers. You can reach me if you have any questions, thoughts about this episode, or sponsorship opportunities at millie@stitchesandstories.com. That's MILLY at stitchesandstories.com. Stitches and Stories is spelled out. So thank you for spending time with me today. Again, I'm Millie. This is Stitches and Stories Studios, where stories begin. Until next time, keep writing, keep reading, and don't forget to make a little room for your story that you keep returning to.